My name is Vanessa Holt. I am 36 years old. On the afternoon of my surgery, my parents sat in the stands at my niece's soccer game, checking their phones between plays for updates from the hospital. They did not come. I had my attorney meet me in recovery instead, and when they finally stopped by that night, smelling faintly of stadium concessions, they had no idea what that afternoon had already cost them. I want to explain the surgery first, because the medical details matter for understanding the timeline, and the timeline matters for understanding why that particular afternoon became the hinge point it did. I had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a tumor in my thyroid that required removal, along with a portion of surrounding tissue due to some irregular cell findings that my endocrinologist wanted addressed surgically rather than monitored. It was not the most dangerous procedure a person can have, but it was not minor either. There were real risks involved, the kind that require informed consent conversations and preoperative discussions about what happens if complications arise, and I had spent those 8 months managing both the medical logistics and the particular kind of fear that comes with waiting for a date on a calendar that you both want to arrive and dread. I am the older of 2 daughters. My sister Diane has 2 children, a son who is 12 and a daughter. My niece Haley, who was 10 at the time and had recently become serious about competitive soccer, the kind of youth league that runs travel tournaments most weekends and treats Saturday games with the gravity of a much bigger occasion than they probably warrant. My parents, Carol and Russell, had become deeply invested in Haley's soccer career over the past 2 years, in the way grandparents sometimes attach themselves fully to one grandchild's particular pursuit. They went to nearly every game. They had team chairs with the league logo on them. My father had started referring to himself in a joking way that nonetheless reflected something real, as Haley's unofficial assistant coach, despite having no actual role on her team beyond enthusiastic sideline presence. I want to be fair here and say that I do not begrudge my parents their relationship with Haley or their enthusiasm for her soccer games. Grandparents are allowed to have favorite activities with favorite grandchildren, and there is nothing inherently wrong with showing up consistently for a child's sport. What became a problem over time was the way that consistency for Haley's soccer schedule started to function as an excuse for inconsistency everywhere else, including with me. I had noticed this pattern building for a couple of years before the surgery in smaller ways that were each individually forgivable. A birthday dinner moved because of a weekend tournament. A phone call cut short because a game was about to start. None of these things felt significant enough on their own to raise as a grievance, and I had not raised them, partly because I did not want to be the daughter who seemed jealous of her own niece, and partly because I genuinely did not understand, until the day of my surgery, how consistently that pattern would hold even when the stakes were considerably higher than a birthday dinner. My surgery date had been on the calendar for 6 weeks before it happened. I had told both my parents the date as soon as it was scheduled, had reminded them twice in the intervening weeks, and had specifically asked, about 10 days before the procedure, whether they would be available to come to the hospital that day, even if just for an hour in the late afternoon once I was expected to be conscious and stable in recovery. My mother told me during that conversation that she would check the soccer schedule and let me know. I remember feeling a small, specific sting at that response. The idea that my surgery date needed to be checked against a 10-year-old's recreational league schedule before my own mother could commit to visiting me afterward. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that of course she would prioritize correctly once she actually looked at the calendar. She called back 2 days later and told me that Haley had a tournament game that Saturday, the same day as my surgery, kicking off at 2 in the afternoon, and that the team was hoping to advance to the regional bracket if they won, which would be a significant milestone for the under-11 group. She said she and my father had decided they would come to the hospital that morning before the game to see me off, and then attend the game, and then stop by again that evening once visiting hours allowed. I told her that worked, because what else was I going to say? My surgery was scheduled for 10 in the morning. The expected duration was approximately 3 hours, putting me into recovery sometime around 1 in the afternoon, with the first hours after surgery being the period when complications, if they were going to appear, would typically become apparent. My parents did come that morning, briefly, before I was taken back for preoperative preparation. They stayed for about 20 minutes. My father made a joke about how I would feel like a new woman afterward. My mother squeezed my hand and told me she loved me. Then they left for the soccer tournament, which was 40 minutes away, with enough time to make kickoff. The surgery itself went longer than expected, about 4 hours instead of 3, due to what my surgeon later described as some additional irregular tissue that needed to be examined more carefully than originally planned. I came out of anesthesia disoriented and in more pain than I had anticipated, and the post-operative period included several hours where the medical team was monitoring me closely for signs of the specific complication that this type of surgery carries an elevated risk for, related to nerve function near the surgical site. I was, in other words, in the most medically uncertain window of the entire procedure during the exact hours my parents were sitting in folding chairs watching a youth soccer game. I want to describe what those hours were actually like for me because I think it matters for understanding the decision I made. I was frightened in a way that is hard to fully convey unless you have been in that specific position, conscious enough to understand the stakes of what your body might or might not be doing correctly, not yet stable enough to know which way things were going to resolve. My husband, Mark, was with me, and he was steady and present in the way he always is. But there is a particular kind of fear in those hours that even the best partner cannot fully absorb on your behalf. I had been thinking, in the weeks before the surgery, about my will and the various legal arrangements I had never gotten around to formalizing properly. I had a basic will from years earlier that named my parents as contingent decision makers in certain medical and financial scenarios, a document I had drafted in my late 20s before I was married, before Mark existed in my life, and had simply never updated, because updating it required scheduling an appointment with an attorney, and I had kept deprioritizing it, the way people deprioritize unpleasant administrative tasks that do not feel urgent until suddenly they do. Sitting in that hospital bed in the hours after surgery, with my parents at a soccer game 40 minutes away, something in me reached a kind of clarity I had been avoiding for years. I asked Mark to call my attorney's office and ask if she could come to the hospital that afternoon, even briefly, to discuss updating my documents. My attorney, a woman named Diane Castellano, who had handled some unrelated property matters for Mark and me a few years earlier, was able to rearrange her afternoon and came to the hospital around 4 o'clock. While I was still groggy from anesthesia but coherent enough to have the conversation clearly, with Mark present as a witness to my state of mind, I want to be precise about what we discussed and changed, because I think the details matter more than the general gesture. The original will named my parents as the people who would make medical decisions on my behalf if Mark were somehow also incapacitated, and named them as contingent beneficiaries for a portion of my estate, in a clause that predated my marriage and had simply never been removed. We revised the medical power of attorney to name Mark as the sole primary decision maker, with my sister Diane, not my parents, as the contingent backup. A choice I made because Diane, whatever her own limitations as a sibling, had a closer working relationship with my actual medical history than my parents did, having helped me with logistics during chemotherapy scares earlier in my life that my parents had been similarly unavailable for. We also updated the contingent beneficiary language, removing my parents from that role entirely, and redirecting that portion to a scholarship fund Mark and I had been discussing setting up in honor of my late grandmother, who had been, by contrast to my parents showing that day, the most consistently present person in my childhood. None of this was done in anger, despite how it might sound described this way. I want to be honest that my emotional state during that conversation with my attorney was not rage. It was closer to clarity, the specific kind of clarity that arrives when you finally let yourself see a pattern you have been making excuses for and decide to respond to what is actually true rather than what you wish were true. My parents arrived at the hospital around 7 that evening, having gone home after the soccer game to shower and eat dinner before coming. Haley's team had won and advanced to the regional bracket, which my father mentioned within the first minute of walking into my room, with genuine excitement that I do not begrudge him for feeling, even as I noted internally the order of priorities that excitement represented. I did not tell them what I had done that afternoon. There was no confrontation in that hospital room. I was tired, genuinely physically depleted in the particular way major surgery leaves you, and I did not have the capacity that evening for the conversation that the situation eventually required. I let them visit for about 30 minutes, accepted my father's update about the soccer tournament with as much warmth as I could manage, and let them leave believing the day had unfolded normally. The actual conversation happened about 6 weeks later. Once I had recovered enough to think clearly and had decided I owed my parents honesty about what I had changed, even though I was under no legal obligation to inform them, and even though part of me wondered whether silence might have been simpler, I invited them to dinner at my house, just the two of them, and told them directly, calmly, what I had done that afternoon while they were at the soccer tournament. I explained the medical power of attorney change, naming Mark with Diane as contingent rather than them. I explained the beneficiary change, redirecting that portion toward the scholarship fund. My mother's first reaction was hurt, which I had anticipated and tried to receive without immediately defending myself because I think hurt was a reasonable initial response even if I believed the underlying decision was sound. She asked whether this meant I no longer trusted them at all, whether this was somehow a punishment for the soccer game. I told her it was not a punishment. I told her it was a recognition, arrived at during the most medically uncertain hours of my surgery, that when it mattered most, in the hours where complications would have needed someone present and decisive, they had chosen a 10-year-old soccer tournament. I told her I did not think that choice made them bad people or bad grandparents. But I told her it had clarified something about who I could realistically count on in a crisis, and that my legal documents needed to reflect reality rather than the version of our relationship I had been hoping was still accurate. My father was quieter during this conversation than my mother, which is often how he processes difficult things. He eventually said that he understood, that he could see how it looked from where I had been lying that day, and that he was sorry, genuinely, even if he was still working through what exactly he was sorry for. We have talked about it several more times since that dinner. My relationship with my parents has not been severed, but it has shifted into something more honest than it was before, with fewer assumptions on either side about what the other party will reliably show up for. My mother has, to her credit, been more consistent in the time since, has asked more specifically about my follow-up appointments, has shown up for smaller things that I do not think she would have prioritized before that conversation forced a reckoning neither of us had wanted to have. She has not asked me to reverse any of the legal changes, which I think reflects a genuine understanding on her part that the decision was not punitive in the way she initially worried it might be, and that asking me to undo it would be asking me to pretend I had not learned something true about where I stood that afternoon. I think about that afternoon often, the specific image of my parents in their team chairs 40 minutes away while my attorney sat beside my hospital bed working through documents that would quietly redefine who I trusted with the most important decisions of my life. I do not think they fully understood, sitting in those chairs, that the choice they were making that day was a choice with consequences extending well beyond a single missed visiting hour.